Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My co-host and I are really excited to have you here as we dive into some of the insights gleaned from a longitudinal study on both the personal and some of the environmental stressors that drive student sustainability and degree completion. On behalf of Two Story, each year we take on a few strategic projects, and this work with Gillian, this project with her and her team at UC Irvine has been both quite innovative and incredibly important. And so this work began 18 months ago. We're delighted to bring you up to speed to share some of the emerging results of our work with you. And we're going to get started with just a very brief introduction. My name is Michael Mueller. I lead the lab at Two Story. And Two Story is it's a boutique AI and machine learning consultancy. Our team, the lab, is this interdisciplinary group of both behavioral scientists and data scientists. And together, we're on a mission to figure out how we develop tools and technology to improve the human experience at work. I'm joined by my co-host, Gillian Hayes. Gillian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Gillian. I am about 6 weeks into a new job as Vice Provost for Academic Personnel here at UC Irvine, which means I get to help steward the professional development for our postdocs all the way through our very senior faculty. Before that time, I was the Vice Provost for Graduate Education, which is how I got to know Michael through this exciting project that we've been working on. And I continue to think about how we can best support our scholars, whether they be at the graduate student or the undergraduate student or the faculty level through these kinds of innovative approaches. I'm also a computer scientist by training, so I'm kind of a data nerd.
So about 18 months ago, when Gillian and I were exploring some of the different ways to collaborate, we had a recurring theme of talking about students and their degree completion, recognizing that it was one of the few highly complex problems that had a lot of shared consequences. It was one of the problems that if we could solve it would have a pretty dramatic impact for all of the stakeholders in the system. This running list that you see on the screen represents some of the feedback that we've heard from members of the ecosystem. So when we think about whether it's faculty or staff from the institution, students themselves, program leaders and deans, the concept of degree completion appears to be one of those problems that has a lot of consequences that extend beyond some of the surface level or the obvious. Gillian, is there anything you'd add from your point of view that you've heard from other leaders on campus on why we are solving this problem?
I think that's right. I mean, we are in the middle of a decades-long culmination of sort of a trend where we see students with serious mental health challenges. We see the possibilities of faculty jobs diminishing, and graduate students are getting much more expensive all at the same time. And so the idea that we need to really optimize our investment, both for the students' well-being and for the university's benefit, is becoming much more pervasive in all of the conversations that I'm in. And this is one of Michael's things he likes to point out about me. For those of you out there, if you are similarly positioned as leaders in graduate education, this feeling will probably be familiar. We can't figure out why some of these students seem to leave with a master's and not complete the PhD. And this is one of the great mysteries. We look at all of our incoming PhD students, and the ones who wind up leaving look exactly the same in terms of their undergraduate GPA, in terms of, in many cases, their graduate GPA, even at least in the first year or two before things sort of turn south. They look the same in terms of their activities, in terms of their recommendation letters that we get. I mean, if we knew how to figure this out, we might do admissions differently, but we don't. And so we have all these really stellar students who we invest a few years in them, and they invest a few years in us, and they don't complete the PhD. And it's one of the great mysteries that we continue to have in this space.
So when we began to design our approach, Gillian and I opened up some of the creative thinking and began to think about how might we solve this problem of degree completion with a different approach, going beyond just data analytics with the existing data, and began to ask questions on, and form hypotheses and research questions on, what is the root cause of why students leave? And how do we get signal into students that may need our help so that we can get them the tools and the resources that they need to improve student success and ultimately degree completion? In this next section, I want to unpack a little bit of our approach to solve this problem, and then we'll get into some of the early results. Again, we wanted to take a different approach. We wanted to expand some of the data sources that we were looking at and analyzing, and really look at the root cause of why students were completing their degree. And so, as Gillian mentioned, 18 months ago, we had this bold idea that we would perhaps use a different set of data sources. In partnership with UC, the team at Two Story used an assessment that allows us to quantify the emotional health of students and use some of the contributing factors of their emotional health to be able to identify what their unique needs were for degree completion and for student success. This work is incurred in 3 concurrent lanes. And so here in this first lane, in the measure phase, we're inviting students to complete Habit Story. Habit Story is an empirically validated psychometric assessment that allows us to truly measure and quantify the emotional health of students. It reveals the specific contributing factors to emotional health, including both internal and external stressors. We're finding already that the granular detail, really identifying what it is that's driving stress for that individual student, allows us to be more prescriptive and more targeted in how we help them. For instance, when we find that students are perhaps have a gap on the productive habits, we're looking at ways of having more skill building and coaching to help them improve productive habits. When we find that a student might have elevated counterproductive habits, some futile or limiting belief that might be holding them back, we're looking at ways of coaching and counseling to address some of those counterproductive habits or derailers. And for others, the environment, the external factors in their life are what stresses and ultimately distracts them from their coursework and the work on the PhD program. And for those students, we're working on more systemic solutions and boundaries and barriers that help them manage the interim. I'll share an overview of what we're finding in the Habit Story results in just a moment. In the second phase, in this discover phase, this is a research stream of longitudinal research that began 18 months ago and we anticipate will continue into the future. In the discover phase, we are using AI and machine learning to correlate the Habit Story measures to some of the critical steps and milestones for student success, ultimately leading to degree completion. So for instance, on the coursework, we're looking at their grades and we're looking at the pace to complete coursework and qualifying exams. On the research front, we're looking at how they receive funding, their participation in conferences and submitting papers. And then there's some interesting intervening variables that we're exploring, things like the advisor relationship, and does volatility and turnover with their advisor impact their participation. This work has begun and will continue in future years. Our third stream has to do with how we actually support students. What do we practically do if we've discovered that there are some gaps in the measurement phase? The support stage for us has challenges related to scale. And so there's been an incredible amount of work done on innovation and technology to be able to support students at scale. And here we're doing digital coaching, where a large language model technology that I'll unpack in a moment is designed to help students identify their particular gaps, their unique needs, the specific stressors that are likely to impact them, and help them address their root cause. Overall, our goal in this project and in this research is to both measure emotional health and then use technology to discover which of those factors are driving outcomes that lead to degree completion so that we can help students along the way address their specific needs and their root cause. So the fun part, let's unpack some of the initial results. One of the first things that we do anytime we look at a new population, a new cohort, and begin to collect the Habit Story data is we look at the composite scores for the population as a whole. So what's displayed on the screen now is what we refer to as the first talent signature. The talent signature is a comparison of the composite cohort. So this is the average scores for the doctoral students that are participating in the program. And we compare their scores to the global norm. By comparing scores to the global norm, we begin to call out and be able to analyze what are the defining characteristics for this group. Where are the areas where this group as a population has scores that are either significantly higher than the global norm or significantly lower than the global norm? I'll come back to a few of these names in just a moment. The next thing we do is we look at the standard deviation and the variance for this particular group. When we find that there is a feature like blame shift on the screen that is both elevated for a particular group and yet has distinction on the scores within the group, we start to form some hypotheses around that particular habit being one of the potential habits that could be used to predict and be a part of a classification model down the road. The variance in this data cannot be understated. This would suggest that there is not a one-size-fits-all, as you all know, to student success. In fact, there are significant and unique needs within the population. So as I mentioned before, that many of these habits that we've displayed here, and can certainly follow up and unpack more in greater detail, but many of these habits that are displayed have significant deviance from the global norm and significant deviation. When we drill down to the individual level, we get a lot of insight into help that particular student. Gillian, I know this was one of the really defining moments in the early stages of the research when I think you began to take some of this global data and like drill down into how to use it as a particular advisor. Would you be willing to share with the group some of what you discovered when you used this with your students?
Yeah, so the thing that surprised me about this, I should start with saying I find most psychometrics to be not that insightful. And I find I can game almost any of them, right? So I've done them all. But with this particular one, I was so enthusiastic about the sort of understanding that it brought to my own understanding of myself and my own habits that, as you remember, I asked if we could try it out on some of my grad students. And they were nice enough to let me take a look at their reports, and going through them, there were a few students who I had a realization that I had been misinterpreting some of their behaviors. And so places where I thought they were sort of worrying about things in the wrong way or whatever, I started to be able to understand, well, why are they worrying about them and what can I do to help them not do those kinds of things. So having a conversation with you, it was really helpful. I was able to see with this one student that she just tends to get way ahead of herself and thinking about problems that haven't emerged yet. And talking to her about it, I could start to say, that's really great insight, but we're not there yet. So let's just hold that for a minute. And we actually started a practice where she would keep a different list of kind of things that might come up in the future, which was helpful to her because ignoring them wasn't going to work. But putting them somewhere else that we didn't have to think about them right away would. And I don't know that I would have done that exact thing with her if I hadn't sort of had this insight. And so I think there's a lot of advisors out there who are like me, who they're very well-meaning. They might tell a student, for example, oh, don't worry about that. That's not a big deal. And we think that we're being helpful and supportive by saying this thing that you're worried about isn't a big deal. Don't worry about it. But that's actually the exact opposite of what they want to hear. They want to hear, oh yeah, it is a big deal and you do need to worry about it, but not yet. And so just even those little tweaks to the way that we talk to them, because we understand now where they're coming from, has been incredibly helpful to me in my own advising. And I think if we can figure out a way to scale it, which is always the challenge, these are the kinds of things that can help our students get there.
Yeah, I remembered a second example where maybe because we were looking at the results back to back, but there were pretty dramatic differences in some of the results for your students, right? I remember one of them had extremely high openness scores, and for them, they really got excited imagining what's next. They were exploratory in nature, and at times that might lead to being distractible. And for others, they were really overwhelmed with the exact thing that they were working on, and they needed a lot of structure. And I remember you actually adapting your style so that for the person that wanted to explore, you spent all your time describing what the final outcome was and gave them a lot of freedom in how they got there. But for person number two, you were prescribing specific milestones so that they could stay focused on the next right step without getting overwhelmed. And again, I think you said it really well, but the advisors that I've interacted with, many of them are doing 2 or 3 jobs, and so as well-meaning as they are, it can be challenging to really be able to make an impact with students when you have such little time with them. And being able to get those insights to know, if I were to do one thing for this student, what's going to make the biggest impact, seemed to unlock a type of focus that really helped them make an impact in the short amount of time that they had.
That's absolutely true. And so often my students will present in really similar ways to me, and they'll say really similar things, but what's underlying that is really hard to figure out. And so with the example you just gave, it's so true. The same 2 students will come in and tell me they're struggling with this particular task, but it's hard to figure out that one of them is struggling because she needs more detail and more grounding, and the other one's struggling because she doesn't know why she's doing it and doesn't care and wants to get on to the next thing. the way you coach those two people is radically different. And I don't think that's something, I know for sure it's something I was never taught. And I think it's something most faculty aren't really taught how to mentor in that way and how to see underneath what's going on. And any insight that we can gain is just so helpful in those situations.
Yeah, certainly. I think if we were to zoom out and make sense of some of the initial data, there's one particular theme that stands out more than any other. We refer to a combination of three habits as the burnout triad. Drain, strain, and blame shift are all individual habits measured with the habit story instrument. And we're finding that doctoral students in the US today have significantly elevated scores in this triad compared to an age-banded like control group that's not in a higher ed doctoral program. The three of these habits are interdependent, and they created a bit of a vicious cycle that I'll unpack. So we're finding that drain, which is a setback, a loss, some sort of negative occurrence or negative circumstance, tends to perpetuate the habit of strain. And strain is the habit of exerting significant effort. It's pain-inducing exertion. It's pushing yourself really, really hard to try to make things work. And blame shift often follows, which is the acknowledgement that something did not go as intended and choosing to blame some sort of external cause rather than choosing to take ownership for the circumstances. So if I were to now translate some of what we're seeing in habit story to student success, what we're encountering in the data is that the average doctoral student is simply not prepared to navigate the hardship that they might experience in the program. And for many of them, when they encounter hardship, their response is to amp up their effort and try really, really hard to push themselves, sometimes beyond their limit. That a fear-induced scarcity mindset pushes them to simply try to increase their effort to make ends meet. But when their effort is not enough for them, it can be difficult to cope with the circumstances. And so they can find themselves entrenched in a sense of learned hopelessness and blame shift, which of course sets themselves up to experience future setback and loss. And so we see this data, and I remember really vividly last fall, Gillian and I, with our research hat on, we're thinking about this long-term longitudinal study that will absolutely continue. But we frankly saw the data and began to feel quite compelled to do something in the short term, to take some of the insights that were gleaned and begin to make a real impact with students, to help them unwind some of these limiting beliefs and some of these habits that they're encountering. And so finding number one, the elevated scores in Burnout Triad have really pushed us to try to find ways of scaling the solutions. Of course, we're doing training and coaching and equipping student success teams on campus. And yet we're also working, as I mentioned, on some technology solutions that allow us to really scale the intervention. And so the second finding that I want to unpack today has to do with our insights and our progress in developing the technology to scale digital coaching. Of course, we started with a lot of the off-the-shelf models. You can imagine the OpenAI and Gemini and Mistral and Clouds, the large language models that provide a type of coaching for students. And yet we found that off-the-shelf models, these large language models, have some legitimate strengths and a few notable weaknesses. Namely, off-the-shelf models can be fairly competent at assessing mental states. They are capable of generating natural text and they can synthesize information from a wide range of sources. They're grammatically correct, but their advice is generic, largely based on the fact that their training data set is Reddit and other scraped web sources. The advice that was given was sometimes unhelpful for really meeting students' needs. To give you a specific example of this, one of the primary findings that we found was that the large language models off the shelf tend to ruminate with problems rather than be a constructive source of behavior change and counseling to help people change their circumstances. Ruminating represents largely what we see on the internet and what perhaps a maybe generic approach to hearing somebody struggling, but that's incongruent and it's frankly not it's not leveraging some of what we learned about how to actually help somebody who is experiencing challenges. And so the first innovation was an effort to embed an evidence-based approach to behavior change into the large language model. This is a partnership between the large language model and the prompts that we use, where we guide the LLM to have a 5-step sequence of helping students. It begins with empathetic validation, acknowledging and recognizing that their experience is legitimate, that we want to understand where they're coming from. There's a reappraisal of the effect to truly understand with objectivity and with a sense of realism, what is the impact of their current behavior, the how's that working for you approach. And then there's a seeking to understand and positioning himself as a collaborative resource to look at solutions. There's like beautiful language in the LLM about like being on their team to help them evaluate scenarios and be able to drive change that really makes a difference. The second innovation is a retrieval augmented generation algorithm. This is a technique, a relatively newer technique in the world of generative AI that leverages a independent data source to help the LLM be more substantive and more relevant in its recommendations, in its coaching. Said otherwise, the RAG algorithm enables a carefully curated data source of coaching content to use the LLM to provide the coaching. In total, this is effectively leveraging all of the wonderful size and scale of the large language model, but being more relevant for the student and more helpful for them in actually changing their behavior. We are incredibly excited about this part of the innovation because as many of you know, if you're in student success, there's such limited resources. There's such a finite capacity to meet the needs of all students that, you know, we've heard across the country, there's student success teams, there's wellness centers that are meeting, you know, perhaps like the very right side of the distribution, helping just a handful of students who ask for help and who are actively seeking out that help. But this technology scales in a way that helps us meet the needs of many students.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that resource constraint thing enough. So both I see it within my own work here at the graduate division, but also for the last few years, I've served on the system-wide the system-wide committee for student mental health across the whole UC system. And so that looks at undergraduate and graduate and everyone. And our counseling centers are unbelievably overwhelmed. We just keep adding counselors and we still have weeks-long waiting lists. At the graduate division here at UCI, we have 2 academic counselors. So in addition to the sort of mental health support, these are people who are really about helping you with project management and just be successful in your graduate program. They have a couple of week waiting list. I mean, it's just, no matter what we do, we don't seem to be able to add enough human bodies to address the real issue. And on the faculty side, this winds up being that faculty who've never really been trained as therapists are doing a whole lot of work in supporting our students. So anything that we can do to augment that faculty engagement, augment those counseling centers and other places is so valuable to universities. I can't even begin to tell you.
Yeah, in total, we're here at the 18-month mark of the project and really excited. It's scaling this fall and getting significantly bigger in terms of the number of students impacted. The digital coach will be rolled out this fall. And so our invitation for you today, if you find this interesting, if you are compelled to participate in some way, we are going to continue this work. And a few milestones, we're synthesizing the progress made and having at times an invitation for people to participate in the next step. And so if you find yourself interested in some way, I'd like to invite you to join us and to participate in some way. This QR code will send you to a form where if you'll share your email with us, we'd be delighted to share with you research briefs as they're made available. Again, at certain milestones, we're stepping up to synthesize what we've learned and invite people to respond accordingly. And so we'd love to have you included in this. This work is really, really important to us as we think about the degree completion and the student experience in doctoral programs. We're seeing some, frankly, concerning data points in the habit story data that leave us compelled to respond. We know that if the intervention includes human resources, there's going to be a finite impact made. And so as we transition into year two, we are really investing in the technology side to find solutions at scale. I think 6 months from now, there's going to be a lot of new data on not only what are the habituatory symptoms, but now how are they playing out for students, and what can we do with or without this, the digital coach even, to help make an impact for the students. And so I'm delighted to join us today. Thank you for being here. Please sign up for Research Priest if you'd like to continue, and we hope this is just chapter 1 of many more to come.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael,
Excellent.
for letting me join in this conversation with you.
You bet. My pleasure. Thanks, Gillian, for being here, and thank you all for joining.